It was a serene dawn in Rome. The sky above the Vatican, painted with soft hues of gold and blue, seemed to conceal a foreboding something not yet spoken, but hovering over the rooftops of the Holy See like a whisper from the Spirit. The corridors of the Roman Curia, usually marked by quiet routines and discreet glances, were filled with a contained expectation. The date, July 15th, did not mark any liturgical solemnity or the feast of a particularly popular saint, but for those attuned to the subtle rhythms of the Vatican, it was evident that something extraordinary was about to unfold. At 9:42 a.m., the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang in an unusual pattern for spaced chimes, followed by a profound silence. It was the unofficial signal that a papal gesture had been made without prior announcement, an event rare in itself. Journalists, theologians, and faithful observers attuned to the symbolic language of the Holy See immediately began to ask, what has Leo XIV done this time? At exactly 10 a.m., the Vatican press office bulletin was updated with a brief but striking statement. It was not a resignation, nor a traditional cardinalatial appointment. It was something new, deeply symbolic, spiritual, and pastoral. Pope Leo XIV had conferred upon Cardinal Matteo Zuppi was granted the unprecedented title of Defender of Indestructible Hope. The choice of words typical of Leo XIV's mystical and poetic style immediately stirred both perplexity and emotion. This was not an administrative promotion. There were no canonical benefits or juridical powers associated with it. It was, above all, a public recognition of an invisible mission that Zuppi had been fulfilling for decades. The mission of carrying hope as a living sacrament, especially among those who had lost everything. In the handwritten text published alongside the official declaration, Leo XIV wrote, "In a time when so many build walls of fear and cynicism, there was one man who walked barefoot through the ruins of war, abandonment, and doubt. He did not bring solutions, he brought presence. He did not bring speeches, he brought listening." Matteo Zuppi did not merely represent the Church, he embodied it in places where the world no longer expected redemption. For this reason, today, the Church does not recognize in him a function, but a flame, the hope that does not surrender to the impossible. The gesture shocked the Vatican. Priests wept, journalists set aside their scheduled agendas. In various apostolic embassies, diplomats reported complete silence in their offices, because everyone, in some way, understood this was not a ceremonial title. It was a prophetic announcement. Matteo Zuppi, Archbishop of Bologna and one of the most beloved figures in the Italian Church, was already known for his involvement with the San Egidio community, his quiet efforts in peace negotiations, and his genuine closeness to the poor, the migrants, and the forgotten. But on that day, his name ceased to be just one among the cardinals. It became the living image of a new model of ecclesial leadership, not the administrator but the consular, not the politician but the pilgrim, not the prince of the church but the servant of the least. In the days that followed, the impact was subtle yet profound. On social media, young people who had left the faith began to comment, "If this is the church, I want to come back." In prisons, hospitals, and refugee camps, images of Zuppi began to circulate like modern icons, and in many dioceses, priests began including the phrase used by the Pope, indestructible hope, in their homilies. Leo XIV's decision also marked a new theological chapter. Theologians began to debate the significance of recognizing a virtue, not a function, as the foundation of pastoral mission. Some called it a return to the roots of the gospel. Others saw it as a prophetic advance in understanding the role of the heart in church governance. But all agreed on one point: something new had begun, and the most surprising moment was still to come. Upon learning of the title, Matteo Zuppi refused all interview requests. He sent only a handwritten message, read by an auxiliary bishop during Sunday Mass in Bologna. "If hope is indestructible, it is because it does not belong to me. I merely carry it, like one carries a flame in their hands, with reverence, with gratitude, and with humility. May it never be extinguished, and may it consume me, if necessary." The Church, once again, took a deep breath, because when a pope sees the invisible, and when a shepherd accepts to be a flame and not a display, the world opens itself to the possibility of miracle. In the next chapters of this video, we will dive deeper into this decision, into the spiritual roots of Zuppi, into the implications for the future of the Church, and into the silent call that this is beginning to echo everywhere: the call to hope that does not break, the call to a faith that consoles, the call to a church that does not command but accompanies. Prepare yourself, because this is not just another story from the Vatican. It is a story of light, a story about what happens when tenderness becomes the official politics of the kingdom. That was a gray afternoon in Rome, and the sky seemed to reflect the weight and serenity of days that precede great spiritual shifts. The clouds blanketed the ancient rooftops of the Vatican. Yet inside St. Peter's Basilica, a different kind of light was beginning to emerge, from stained glass, but from within a gesture that had not yet been revealed to the world. Few knew it, but in recent months, Pope Leo XIV had been praying in secret for a delicate discernment. It was not about a doctrinal issue, nor a diplomatic crisis. It was a silent, deep, unresty one that concerned the future of the pastoral face of the church, who, in the midst of a fragmented world, could touch hearts without raising walls, who could embody mercy without compromising truth, who carried, not in words but in their eyes, the gentle fire of the gospel. And then, the name of Matteo Zuppi, Archbishop of Bologna, began to re-emerge in the Pope's heart. Zuppi was known throughout Italy as a shepherd among the people. It was not uncommon to see him sitting in public squares, visiting prisons, listening to forgotten elderly in nursing homes, or walking side by side with the poor through the streets of Bologna. His speeches never relied on grand rhetoric, but they always left silence in their wake, a silence born from being deeply touched. Over the years, Matteo Zuppi had cultivated a spirituality of encounter. In his homilies, he preferred to tell real stories rather than cite theological manuals. He spoke of Jesus as one speaks of a friend, and that is what made him so dangerous to the indifferent and so beloved by those in search of meaning. Leo XIV knew this, and he knew the Church urgently needed to relearn the language of affection and truth united. That is why, in an absolutely unprecedented gesture, Pope Leo XIV convened a private celebration inside the Sistine Chapel. No press, no invited cardinals, only a small group of spiritual witnesses, contemplative nuns, a handful of young catechists, 2 refugees, and a missionary couple. At the center, the Pope and Matteo Zuppi, with a simple chalice and a wooden cross placed on the altar. Leo XIV declared, his voice firm and moved, "Today, I do not simply name a cardinal. Today, I entrust to the heart of the Church a mirror of the heart of Christ. Matteo Zuppi, from this moment on, you shall be the shepherd of the margins." This new title was not ceremonial, it was a spiritual direction. With it, Leo XIV signaled to the world that the center of the Church no longer resided in its structures, but in its encounter with the forgotten, that true leadership does not descend from the summit, but rises from the ground. The news spread, slowly, like a breeze. It didn't make headlines, but it passed through souls that same week. Thousands of people began to travel to Bologna not for tourism, but to witness firsthand what a diocese looked like where love had become gesture. Churches opened their doors 24 hours a day. Young people organized night vigils. Priests went out on spontaneous missions through alleyways. And amid all of it, Zuppi remained the same, in his worn coat, with a calm smile and a listening heart. On a later interview, Leo XIV stated, "We are not looking for heroes. We are looking for mirrors of Jesus. And there is no mirror more faithful than the one that reflects another's pain as its own." With this appointment, the Pope didn't just create a new position. He created a new path, a path where care is not strategy to spirituality, where mission is not a program, it is presence, where authority is exercised kneeling, with eyes that recognize in the poor the face of the Savior. From that gesture forward, something began to shift in dioceses around the world. In Buenos Aires, a bishop asked to live in a modest house. In Kinshasa, seminarians launched a listening project in local prisons. In Krakow, an entire parish committed to a year of liturgical silence, replacing homilies with moments of communal listening. The silent revolution of Zuppi was underway, and at its center, a conviction that Leo XIV insisted on repeating in a letter to the people of God: the future of the Church will not be decided in power consortia, but in chapels where the world's weeping is heard. Matteo Zuppi, the shepherd of the margins, became more than a man. He became a symbol, a gesture, a living bridge between suffering and hope. And that is why, when looking back on this moment in history, many say that was when the pastoral heart of the Church began to beat again. Prepare yourself, because in the next segments, we'll dive into the fruits of this decision. How Zuppi inspired a new form of catechesis, how entire communities were transformed, and how, in a noisy world, a simple gesture of listening became a living prophecy. It was an ordinary Sunday in Bologna. The streets were damp with the light rain that had started at dawn, and the parish bells rang out a melody familiar to the residents, a gentle call, almost imperceptible to those who live in a hurry. But that morning, something invisible hovered over the city. There was a sense of waiting, an expectant silence, as if heaven itself knew it was about to hear a response at the parish of St. Dominic. In the heart of the city, a small group of faithful gathered around the altar. Among them, discreetly seated in the second-to-last pew, holding a rosary in his hands, was Matteo Zuppi. No title, no ornate vestments, no gesture of authority, just a man in prayer. A man who listens. At that very moment, in the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV was writing at his desk with black ink and slow calligraphy. What flowed from his pen was not a typical appointment but a spiritual recognition, a gesture that would alter not only Zuppi's position in the hierarchy, but the way the Church listens to those who cry on the streets. The document, titled Letter on Apostolic Compassion, carried simple yet gospel-charged words. The Church needs eyes that see with mercy, ears that hear with humility, and feet that walk unafraid through the margins. Matteo Zuppi does not represent a wing of the Church, he represents its missionary heart. The news wasn't announced with pomp nor read from grand pulpits. It was quietly placed on the inner pages of L'Osservatore Romano, But one night was enough for the whole world to begin talking. The reason: the Pope's stunning decision to create a completely new title within the Curie: unprecedented, unwritten and without precedent, prefect of the invisible people, and to assign it Matteo Zuppi according to Leo XIV. The title conferred no power, it conferred presence. It was not a new congregation, it was a new form of listening, a silent ministry, with the mission of representing, within the Holy See, those the world does not see: the homeless, the ignored migrants, abandoned elderly, young people trapped between addiction and despair. Zuppi would have no throne, no offices. Desk would be the confessional, the park bench, the subway seat, the soup kitchen table. It was a gesture that unsettled the Curie-An, moved the peripheries, and it became the seed of a new ecclesial language. And this Matteo Zuppi did with ease because it was how he had learned the gospel. In alleyways, in humble homes, in the tears of others. He once said in a rare homily, "The best theology I ever heard came from a woman who told me, 'Father, heaven begins when someone holds your hand without asking your name.'" It was with this theology that Zuppi began to inspire thousands of young people, especially those who had felt excluded by the formal language of faith. Catechists began organizing listening circles instead of lectures. Priests left the pulpit and stepped onto the church floor. Religious sisters began visiting shelters with the mission of being ears that embraced. Thus, the prefect of the invisible people became not only admired but followed. In Naples, a group of former drug traffickers organized a silent march holding signs with Zuppi's quotes. In Lisbon, exiled youth created a community called the Circle of Listening, and in Buenos Aires, a rabbi and an imam officially requested an audience with Matteo, not to dialogue about doctrine, but to sit with him in silence and cry. Zuppi welcomed them all, as he always did, without agenda, without cameras, without distinction. And in one of the last times he appeared publicly, during an evening mass celebrated in a public square, he looked at the crowd and said, "If you feel invisible, then know that it is precisely for you that I was sent." The square wept, and Rome understood that the prophecy was alive. There was no announcement on giant screens, no crowd applauded, no TV channel interrupted its programming, and yet something profound began to shift, not in the marble structures of the church, but in the silent hearts who had long waited for an authority that listens before commanding, weeps before legislating, and serves before governing. This was the silent revolution born from the spiritual friendship between Pope Leo XIV and Matteo Zuppi PI. It was a breezy night in Rome when, according to those close to the Pope, he walked unaccompanied into the Vatican gardens and stood silently for several minutes. Before an olive tree planted decades earlier by St. John Paul II, he said nothing, but in his hand, there was a small slip of paper handwritten note from Zuppi that read, "I don't want to be remembered for decisions, but for the times I stood beside those who had no voice." That phrase echoed within Leo XIV like a confirmation, because it was exactly what he wished to restore to the heart of the church, not an empire of decrees, but a sanctuary of listening. And that is why, days later, in an unexpected gesture, the Pope once again surprised the Vatican. He appointed Matteo Zuppi as extraordinary papal ambassador to the wounded places of Istria, titled not found in any canonical archives, but one that expressed a profound truth. Zuppi was not just a bishop, he was a consolation sent. This new role involved no thrones, no motorcades, no political power. It involved walking. It involved kneeling in the places the world had forgotten: abandoned wars, destroyed villages, overcrowded prisons, regions where the gospel had not been wounded by heresy but by indifference. The first mission came weeks later. The Pope sent Zuppi to a Christian community in Armenia, where 72 families had lost everything due to a regional conflict. He brought no cameras, no speeches, only an icon of Mary, bread, wine, and a letter signed by Leo XIV with a single sentence: "We are with you until the end." Zuppi stayed there for a week, sleeping on the floor, helping rebuild huts, listening to stories of pain. Upon returning, he filed no report. He simply handed the Pope a broken stone from the altar of the bombed chapel and said, "This altar still breathes." And the Pope responded with tears. From that moment on, dozens of other missions followed. Matteo traveled to Gaza. He visited refugee camps on the Congo border. He walked through the ruins of Haiti. He sat with victims of human trafficking in Thailand, and in every place, he repeated the same words: "I did not come to represent a state. I came to remind you that heaven still sees you." The press began calling him the Bishop of the Wounded World, but he shied away from titles. When asked by an Italian journalist how he felt about being chosen for such a mission, Zuppi replied with a calm smile, "I feel that I'm being sent where the heart of Christ has already arrived first." This style, soaked in evangelical tenderness, began to positively influence the mindset of other church leaders. There was no more space for titles without embodiment. Priests began requesting missions to the peripheries. Bishops began swapping speeches for journeys to hospitals, shelters, and forgotten villages. In a circular letter, Leo XIV wrote, "The authority of the Church cannot be measured by how far it stands from suffering, but by how close it draws to what the world avoids." Matteo Zuppi reminds us of this. In seminaries, formators established a new discipline, theology of listening. At pontifical universities, Zuppi's writings became required reading for a new generation of pastoral diplomats. In religious houses, many communities revived the practice of radical hospitality not as charity, but as a sacrament of presence. But perhaps the strongest sign came from where no one expected it. In China, a clandestine bishop who had lived in hiding for years due to persecution wrote an anonymous letter to the Pope, sealed with a hand-drawn cross. Inside a single sentence, Zuppi passed through here. He said nothing, but my faith came back to life. And little by little, what had seemed to be just a new leadership style began to be recognized as the birth of a new spiritual era in the Church, a time when the gospel is no longer a theory but a gesture, a time when power becomes the cross. Again, a time when the world, tired of religious speeches, begins to be moved by a witness that doesn't impose but heals. Pope Leo XIV knew exactly what he was doing. By lifting up Zuppi as one of the spiritual faces of his pontificate, he was not seeking popularity, he was seeking prophecy. And Zuppi's prophecy did not shout. It walked barefoot. It waited. It touched. And this is how an invisible revolution began to take form, with a pope who listens and a bishop who walks, a sacred alliance between tenderness and authority, between spirit and flesh, between liturgy and the streets, between heaven and the eyes that still cry on earth. You've made it this far, and perhaps you felt something different. A sacred discomfort, a thirst that cannot be quenched by arguments, a quiet reminder that faith is still possible. Maybe, like Matteo Zuppi, you too have walked through streets where no one saw your pain. Maybe you tried to love and weren't understood. Maybe you listened too deeply and were ignored. But today, this story reaches you, and it says, you are not alone. Close your eyes for a moment. Listen what you feel right now. It may not have a name, but it has a source. It comes from the Spirit. If this story touched your heart, comment below. Lord, teach me to be a bridge between heaven and the pain of men. Share this video with someone who is wounded but still dreams of a faith that listens. Subscribe and turn on the bell because the next message might arrive in silence. And never forget, when the Church listens with the heart, the whole world breathes again.